going back to the maternal, there's a lot to talk about in there, but just going back for a moment for the maternal instinct thing being conditioned. How conditioned do you think it is? Like, I'm minded to think that it is like mostly true, like that maternal instinct is mostly a real biological thing, but that there are surely cases where women don't have it for some reason, and they are under social pressure to pretend that they do. I wouldn't go so far as to say the whole thing is conditioned. I think instinct must be playing quite a significant role. What do you think?
So one thing I want to do to begin is to differentiate baby fever, which might describe the urge to, I want to have a child, and not only that, I want to gestate a child and be pregnant, with maternal instinct, which is, I want to nurture children and raise a family. I think they're actually two slightly distinct things. So I did speak to an evolutionary biologist about this. I also knew, because I'd heard her speaking on a podcast, or on a radio interview on Radio 4, actually, that she would tell me what I wanted to hear. I'm a journalist too, Louise, and so I definitely know how to seek out
I know how it works,
back up my argument. But she stated in no uncertain terms, there is no such thing as a biological urge to reproduce. What human beings have is a sex drive, which is essentially a drive for orgasm. Now, we also know that in women, orgasm is not essential for procreation, whereas it is in men, which I think is interesting. And that's something I didn't quite go into in the book, but I think I will in my rewrite of the applicable chapter for the paperback, because I think it actually has really interesting implications about male entitlement in general. Anyway, so she was sort of saying, from an evolutionary biology perspective, what humans need to be doing is having lots of sex, and then eventually children will come along, and then it's helpful if there is a natural instinct to look after, as in protect, feed, nurture those young infants. That biological maternal instinct can be attributed to when a person becomes the chief caregiver for an infant, there is an increase in size in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that monitors for threat. I heard you speaking on an episode, I think I was listening to it yesterday, where you were talking about this almost incessant sort of OCD checking of whether or not your child is breathing. This is probably your amygdala going, hey, threat, imminent threat, you know? Now, what's really interesting is, I think it was around 2014, studies were done on gay male couples who had adopted children or had children by surrogate as to whether they experienced the same brain changes. And they did. And so this is not this maternal instinct, which is this desire to protect young infants, isn't necessarily predicated on sex. It's more about the actual caregiving role that a person finds themselves in. Now, of course, typically that has traditionally been women. But yes, I did think it was really interesting. Gillian Ragsdale was the name of the person I spoke to, and she sort of said, you know, when rabbits have sex, they're not thinking about making more rabbits. They're just following this instinct to have sex. And she said to me, you know, if you woke up on a desert island tomorrow and your mind had been entirely wiped of what it means to be a human being, she said, on no level would you be thinking, I want to find someone and have a baby with them. You would be looking for food and water, and you would probably masturbate at some point, but you would not be thinking, I must reproduce, you know? So that's where I landed on that. But I think, of course, there is a sex drive, and yes, enough sex, and I will say enough procreative sex leads to children. But then how do we explain homosexuality? How do we explain masturbation? How do we explain any non-penetrative sex and humans' desire and urge for those kinds of sexual activities?
So what do you think's going on with baby fever then, as distinct from maternal
baby
instinct?
fever, so there's a fascinating book, I think you'd probably find it really interesting, by an Israeli social scientist called Orna Donat. It's called Regretting Motherhood. She describes baby fever as often very much about a desire, a very real desire for family, a real desire for intimacy with other human beings, a very real desire for being seen as valid and a respectable member of your community. So she would say that it is entirely conditioned, but of course she's also coming off the back of speaking to lots of women who are like, wait, I thought I was bamboozled into this. This isn't what I wanted for myself personally. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. And I think it would be really interesting for more studies to be done on this subject, you know, how much of this is conditioning and how much of this is biology.
Yeah, I've never had sort of real baby fever, I suppose. I've heard women speak about it as like a very, very intense thing sometimes. I think
physical
particularly
yearning.
yes, and particularly if you're going through IVF. IVF seems to trigger like very intense emotional phenomena, partly because of the hormones you have to take to trigger ovulation, and partly because it's just a fairly brutal process of like, will it be this month? Oh no, I've just lost another 10 grand. Or,
and I think
whatever.
there's
It's really horrible.
A lot of fear of failure tied up in that as well. And this idea that
Right.
if I can't do this, then I am not a valid woman. Then there's something, you know, terribly wrong with me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've heard women talk about having very intense baby fever. I've never experienced it per se, but I have been finding lately that we have a 2.5-year-old, and I find myself when he was little, I didn't look at other babies out and about and think, oh, I want another one. It took a little while until I thought I want another one. And now when I'm out and about and I see a little baby, I look like greedily at the little baby, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to have another baby, which I maybe is baby fever. I think it is clearly the case that one's degree of sort of one's broodiness, shall we say, to use a less scientific term, is varies between individuals. It clearly does. And I think I've always been a more broody person, and some people just clearly aren't. There is clearly natural variation between individuals. And I guess pre-contraception, your reproductive system didn't care, especially if you had sex, then you would have children, and that was that.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I mean, you know, there are definitely women in my family lineage who I think probably should not have been mothers, because it was very deeply incompatible with who they were as individuals, and it caused a huge amount of pain and suffering. And I think that's in lots of people's family histories as well. So the opening chapter of the book I called The Motherhood Spectrum, and as much as talking about this idea of like the can't have kids versus the won't have kids, I also speak about actually, rather than this being a purely biological instinct, it makes absolute sense that everything from a person's basic personality to the family they were raised in, to the community that they're growing up in, to the religious programming that they've received, to their relationship status, to their financial status, all of these things are going to impact a person's desire and aptitude for parenthood. And actually, isn't it great that we have the choice, or the opportunity rather, to weigh all of these factors into what is an irreversible, lifelong decision that is going to impact every single aspect of our lives in perpetuity. And so, yeah, I do. Yeah, of course there is a biological urge. And when I actually spoke to a dear friend of mine who had twins after multiple rounds of very grueling IVF. And I just wanted to know, what made you keep going? It just looked so terribly painful. What made you keep going? And she just said, well, you know, I just felt like I had so much love that inside of me that I just wanted to give to another human being. I just needed somewhere to put this love that I had inside me, which immediately did sort of trigger in me all of those stereotypes about child-free women being uncaring and unloving and not having this sort of nurturing gene, which we so pride and we so admire in women, and we so compliment women for, right? Any woman who chooses a life of the mind over family life will be seen as inherently uncaring, which is obviously, well, I'd hope it's obvious that that's not true, you know? And hearing her describe this sort of just this urge, I suppose, to kind of give of herself in this way, it made me think about the way I've always felt about my ideas. You know, I've always, from a very young child, had just ideas for things I wanted to put into the world and things that I wanted to do. And I feel like, you know, at this point, I've published 6-7 books. I had quite a successful career in journalism in the UK, and people will often look at me and sort of say, wow, you're really prolific. You've really done a lot with your career. And I have. And I think I've actually been driven by a similar sort of urge to what she was describing. I just have so much that I want to put out into the world. But for me, it makes the most sense, taking all of those kind of factors I touched on into account, for me to focus on that from a career perspective.